Marion E. Smith Faculty Achievement Award in 2005, as well as the Honors Thesis Advisor Award in 2006. This fall, he will publish his 10th co-edited book volume, which is actually already published right here. And he is a valued member of our Speaker Series Committee. Additionally, he can be counted on to record our Speaker Series presentations so that those who are unable to attend in person can view the talk at a later date on our YouTube channel. Joe will take questions throughout the talk, and also if you have any announcements, we'll hold them until the end. Thank you, Joe.
All right, thank you so much. I'm going to skip over the introduction because I integrated all into the slides. But I want to thank you all for coming, and Nick Voters, and Francis, and Brenda, who is recording the session today because I'm speaking. And just by way of introduction, I started thinking about this talk. Kathy Dawes presented a workshop on braver angels. And so just maybe an introduction, I really did think, well, you know, this was kind of a helpful talk. Joe, you've been teaching philosophy for a long time. Isn't there some kind of helpful information that you might bestow in this time of culture wars? And what this is really just a broader way to look at judgments and how we formulate judgments and distinguishing different types of judgments. And I guess the takeaway is going to be, if we can't agree about judgment, maybe there is still some kind of core that we can agree about. And I'm going to try and expose that here. And so I'll start out with a little biography about Hume. He was a very interesting man. I'm not going to say too much, but then we're going to look at two models of knowledge, I'll call math and science. And Hume's problem, which is the gateway to the culture wars, is that not all judgments that we make neatly fit into these two models. So sometimes we try to force them in, or sometimes we don't really know what to do with these. And he offers a solution here at Natural Belief and Inference, and I'll take questions. But if you have any questions along the way, feel free to ask. So Hume was a member of the Scottish Enlightenment. You can see his dates. He died in 1776. That should ring a bell for most of us. So he was in the early modern era. He was a British empiricist. And he was a friend of Adam Smith. So Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, but he wrote an earlier, more popular book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And Hume had a theory of moral sentiments that he expressed about 20 years earlier in his book, A Treatise of Human Nature. So they had that in common. And the two were contemporaries, roughly, of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. So these are the four oldest, or the five oldest signers, and they kind of fit in with the dates between Hume and Smith. Hume was a little older than Smith. And in fact, I did some research, and Hume and Franklin were friends. They corresponded. They met on several occasions. In fact, Franklin stayed with Hume for 6 weeks in Scotland when he visited Scotland. And was reading a few of the letters between them, and they seemed to have a very cordial relationship. Something I'll have to explore a little further. I just really found out about that. So the first model, I'll just call math. Whether or not mathematics fits this model, we can talk about in the question and answer period. It's an interesting question. But, and both these models, the key here is that there are two components to a model of knowledge. The type of judgment, and then the type of inference. And inferences get you from judgments to other judgments. So it's how knowledge grows. And so what's special about math is that they have these things that Hume called relations of ideas, and they're necessarily true. The denial is impossible. And then the other special thing is math has special inference rules. They're truth preserving. They never take it from truth to falsity. It preserves truth. And so you get this kind of internal grounding of truth, where either you have sentences like all bachelors are unmarried, a judgment is just made up of ideas, and the ideas of being a bachelor, being unmarried, or connected in a way that sentence always comes out true. Or in the case of mathematics, you have these intuitive propositions that seem necessarily true, and these demonstrative rules that get you other necessarily true sentences. And this very nice body of knowledge. And in science, things are not so elegant. Now, I don't want to say that science is worse than math. In fact, it's just a different kind of knowledge. It's empirical, it's contingent, deniable. So not all truths of science are necessarily true. They could be otherwise, if the world had been otherwise. And then science allows for probable inferences that allow us most likely to get the truth, but not in all occasions. And so it doesn't provide an internal grounding of truth. Scientific facts aren't necessarily true, but they're true by virtue of their correspondence with reality. So there's a kind of external correspondence. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because my understanding of science is that it's always verifiable, that the whole purpose of science is because it's not my truth or your truth, it's the truth because we both can scientifically, through testing, come to that conclusion.
Well, let's just say, what I'll say is there's a way of proving things in science. They have a methodology, and they do have standards of proof. And there's a kind of criteria of what counts as proof, correspondence with reality. And it plays a role both in the formation of laws of nature. We always keep testing to see if these laws are accurate, if we can formulate better laws. And so, so it has a method of proof. And that's why I'm classifying it as a model of knowledge. It's just not a model like scientific model, mathematical knowledge. They're just different models. But they both have their virtues. So, with math, you have certainty, and you have these truth-preserving rules. But the problem with truth-preserving rules is you can never learn anything new. You just cash out the informational value of what you already know. So if we didn't have science, we'd never learn anything new. And so that's why I think the two models complement each other. You can't have knowledge, I think, unless you have the two working together. But then here's what Hume's problem is. There are a bunch of judgments that do not neatly fit into the models. And this is where the culture wars arise. Now we're not going to look at all these judgments. It is a kind of close list of the kinds of judgments that Hume is happen to be interested in. So I could talk about what Hume thinks about any of these, but we're going to focus on the red ones: judgments, perceptual judgments, and judgments of blame. And along the way, I'll have something to say about laws of nature and judgments of beauty. And this is what's interesting. Hume's theory about judgments of blame is in ways very similar to his theory about judgments of beauty. It's the same sort of mechanism, if you will, at work. So let's talk about perceptual inference first. And here's just a simple example. And all I mean by perceptual inference, there's just two constraints. You start with information that based on perception, things that you perceive. And then you end up with a judgment that has existential content that says that something exists. So you start with information in the head, and you end up with information about the world. And now we do this, I'm not saying that this is a bad form of judgment. I'm saying, in fact, it's a good form of judgment, but explaining it is very difficult because it doesn't fit it's not like mathematical inferences, because of course there's a gap between perception and reality. You could be dreaming, you could be hallucinating, you could be in the matrix world. And it's a probable inference, but if you think of any kind of argument from science that you want to use to explain how it is that I know that Francis is in the room because I perceive Francis, all those premises are going to be a lot less certain than the fact that Francis is in the room, right? I mean, there's a kind of immediacy to that knowledge. In fact, if we didn't take perceptual inference for granted, you couldn't do science, right? You have to take these sort of items. Scientists don't write, I perceive, and therefore they say, I see. They go immediately. And so it's a kind of inference that we don't really think about too much. But from a logical point of view, it's very complicated. And I'm just using this as an example. There are different kinds of these judgments that don't fit in. And judgments about value are going to turn out to be some of them, but it's not just values, right? There's other kinds of stuff. Anyway, Hume has a solution. And it's important to realize that part of what he wants to preserve is the integrity of perceptual inference, right? It doesn't, my knowledge that Francis is in the room doesn't depend on anything other than my perception of her. But how can you, so in that sense, it's a little like demonstrative knowledge, a little like math. But in other ways, it's not like math at all. So he develops this theory of natural belief, and the details get kind of complicated. We can talk about those. But here's an example. So we could debate, I used to teach metaphysics, and we did debate about whether or not we have knowledge of laws of nature. So the law of gravity has worked until now. Who's to say it's going to work tomorrow, right? But at the end of the day, we all left through the door and not the window. So there's a sense in which there are certain kinds of claims that we could question the legitimacy of them, but we're not going to seriously deny them, and we're not going to give them up. And Hume calls those natural beliefs. And a belief in the regularities of law is a natural belief. It's universally held. It's resistant to argument, both for and against. You can't really, Wittgenstein has this quote, is making a phone call to New York proof of the existence of the external world? And there's a sense of, it's absurd to think that it isn't, but it's absurd to think that it is, too. But how could you prove that the external world exists? So arguments for some beliefs don't really, for what that we have, we can't really uncover them very easily, even though we feel that we have them with certainty. And for the same reason, they have a resistance to skeptical argument. We don't take the skeptical argument seriously. We understand them on a kind of intellectual level, but we can't live as skeptics. This is a big point of Hume. And so he wants to extend this to judgments of blame. So here's a quote. The mind of man is so formed by nature that upon the appearance of certain characters, dispositions, and actions, it immediately feels the sentiment of approbation or blame. Now, Hume makes a point to distinguish between judgments and sentiments, but in the language he talks about, when he says feel the sentiment of approbation or blame, he's really saying formulate the judgment, the belief of blame, because it's not just a sentiment, right? I mean, when we blame people, we form judgments, and in fact, we act on those judgments too often. And he was aware of all of that. But so there's a kind of immediacy to judgments of blame that are very similar to these perceptual inferences that we make. That's the claim.
Excuse me, are you using blame in the common sense of the word?
Yeah, I think so. I'll explain it more. We'll talk about blame for a few slides, so I'll hash it out a little bit more. But I hope I'm using it in the common sense. So now one little wrinkle I make on Hume's view is I want to extend this view of natural belief to natural inference for a couple of reasons. I mean, if you think of natural beliefs, you think of kind of innate ideas, which is exactly what Hume was sort of against, because he was an empiricist. And what we have in common are not really beliefs. Like, not everybody in the world believes that Francis is in the room. We all do. I mean, but you have to be in the room, probably, in order to formulate that belief. So it arises under special circumstances. So, yeah.
So, Joe, we're in this age of misinformation,
Yeah.
and even our government is giving us misinformation and things that we know to be untrue.
Right.
How does that model, fit into this, like to Hume? Because things were very different at that time, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's going to take a while to answer that
Okay.
question. Let's just wait.
Okay. No, I'm just wondering.
But I think,
Yeah.
I hope to have something to offer you
Right.
at the end of all this.
Right.
It would be horrible if I just submitted you to this philosophical lecture and there was nothing.
Oh, no. I just wondered if there was something like it just, yeah. Okay.
But we do want to distinguish between, I mean, a lot of people believe things are true.
Right.
And we can see now that not only are they wrong, but it's not even clear that truth is the right word when you think about their belief, because it's not true in any internal sense like math, nor is it true in a kind of easy correspondence sense. And so now for Hume, and this partly comes out in the judgments of blame, as we're going to see, we make these projections in the world. So there's like these facts of the world, and then we kind of stain them, add to them. And we do this in the context of blame, which makes sense, but we also do it with things like causation, and we do it in things like perception. I mean, really, our information is about the mind, but we project this information about reality. It's not backed up by evidence. We can't give an argument, but it's just something that we do. Yeah.
I have a question with vocabulary. Judgment. Can you say conclusion? I mean,
yeah. So what I mean by judgment,
yeah.
and that's a really good question, because I want to explain this before, because Hume makes a point to distinguish between judgment and sentiment. And so when we're talking about...
What about conclusion? I mean, you're really saying this and this and then this.
But a judgment is like a potential belief. I mean, there are judgments like, that there are round squares that exist or something. It's not an actual belief, but it's a potential belief. But philosophers today, they talk about propositions. And they have two qualities. They're objects of belief, and they're either true or false. But for reasons that hopefully will be clear, I want to resist talking about truth and falsity, using those terms for value judgments. And hopefully it'll make sense.
Because judgment implies that you have truth or false. I mean, judgment it's not a conclusion, it's a feeling, or it's
Well, we're going to look at it, but there are certain kinds of judgments that don't have that quality. Predictive judgments, as we'll look at in a second. When we draw verdicts, and the reason is because it doesn't have to be guilty or innocence. There might not be sufficient evidence either way. And so truth or falsehood doesn't really neatly fit into that system. I don't want to say it doesn't fit in. This is a really tricky question. I'm just trying to leave room for different ways in which you might answer that question. But so the main thing is I just want to say that these natural beliefs are a product of natural inferences that we share. And so now we're going to look at value judgment. And Hume was concerned with aesthetic judgments and judgments of blame. And as we'll see, the theory is very similar. What he has to say about both of those. What I want to make clear is, what's interesting to me is it's a little different than the way some people think of faith, in the sense that we usually think of morality along these lines. And so we think what's wrong is like some event in the world, some action, something that you do. But for Hume, the wrongness of stealing gets its wrongness because the jinn, it's jinn who is blameworthy. Right here, the stealing is wrong. Here, jinn is blameworthy for the stealing. And so, as we'll see, stealing is just the kind of thing you would normally be blamed for, right? That's what makes it wrong, is people normally have sentiments. No. They find out you've done that. No, that's wrong. That's the theory. And so we'll look at kind of how it works. But first, let's just observe that something like a judgment of blame doesn't easily fit into either of the two models, right? It can't be grounded internally like a relation of ideas because it's possible to deny. You can't deny mathematical claims, but you can deny judgments of blame. And this is where it gets very tricky. Nor is there anything external to the judgment to play the role of a moral fact. And it seems like that's counterintuitive. But what I want to say, what Hume says, crimes do not correspond to events like stealing, since not all stealing is criminal. So, you could have an event type of stealing, stealing some bread, that would be regarded by most people as criminal, but the same event type, under other circumstances, some child is starving, is not going to be regarded that way. So it can't be the events of the world in and of themselves that determines whether or not something is blameworthy or not. And my short answer to this is, what crimes are is they're wrongdoings without exemption or excuse. So they've kind of undergone some review. You've considered possible explanations for this horrible thing, and you only determine that it's a crime if you've ruled out that the other explanations are viable. Here's how Hume explains this. And again, this is very complicated stuff. He says a crime is a complicated object. Then he says a crime is not any particular fact, so it doesn't fit into the science mold, but arises from a complication of circumstances. So there's a kind of double complication of crime. It's a complicated object that arises from a complication of circumstances. Now, usually when we think of crime intuitively, it's the complication of circumstances. This involves at least one victim and a cloistered mental state of intent. You have to intend both morally and legally in order for something to be a crime. There has to be this intent involved. But we haven't reached the crime yet. This is just a complication of circumstances, which, being presented to the spectator, excites the sentiment of blame. So it has to give rise, and now again, sentiment of blame for Hume is just forming the judgment of blame. You have to formulate, after review of the evidence, knowledge of the law, formulate the judgment of blame. So kind of natural inference. It doesn't seem like an inference because it happens so kind of quickly. So it's only a crime provided it would be judged blameworthy by the average person. That is, a crime is just the kind of act that the average person would find blameworthy. And now I want to firm this up a little bit. And so I'm going to talk about these predictive inferences. And this is predictive inference right here. It's just an inference from like matters of fact and norms and values to some verdict. Verdicts could be a lot of different things. So verdicts consist of the delivering of finding, official or unofficial, upon evidence or reasons as to value or fact. So they're common. They're made by a jury, an arbitrator, an umpire. These are all occasions of people making verdicts of some kind. So, so part of the claim is that we have this general capacity for predictive inference. In juries, you don't have to train them how to think. You just have to provide the evidence and the law, and they do the rest. And in fact, if you present somebody with sufficient evidence in a murder case where the norms are pretty clear, you often get a verdict whether you want it or not. So I don't want to mention any cases in particular. You've probably been talking to some people about them. Tell them a few cases. Oh yeah, that guy was guilty. He did it. He was blameworthy. So we formulate these inferences naturally and kind of immediately. And we use predictive inference in morality, the law. This is Hume's aesthetic theory too. What changes are what kinds of facts you take into consideration and what the norms are. So for aesthetics, it's facts about the artwork, together with the history of art and critical theory. They play a role in that.
There's a question.
Yeah.
Joe, what would Hume say about the law and norms being out of sync? Because norms change over time with culture, but it takes much longer for the law to change, the laws to change. That should present a moral question and dilemma.
Yeah, I'm gonna have a clearer answer to that in a minute.
Okay.
Because just wait a minute.
All right.
So in the case of blame, we just have the same kind of inference pattern, but the matters of fact have to include evidence. Now, I guess let me wait to get to that because I do this. But predictive inferences are natural, have standards. That's the key. And so we can idolize the inference. So what Hume wants to say about blame, this is kind of his definition of blame. It's warranted, provided it would be made by the average moral spectator, a fair-minded person with sufficient evidence and acceptance of social norms. But this is where I was going to put it in concluding remarks, but this is the key that answers your question. Warranted blame requires sufficient evidence and acceptance of norms. I mean, there's a couple of things about that. First of all, we have this feeling that, like, values, because they're neither true nor false, you can just say whatever you want. But really, on this view, no. Some value judgments, like judgments of blame, without sufficient evidence for acceptance of norm, are equivalent to like giving informal fallacy or equivalent to a form of fallacious reasoning and admitting that the argument is true. So, so the main payoff is that we have these natural ways of forming these kinds of beliefs, but that in and of itself doesn't mean that they don't require certain standards. And the standards are very clear, right? You need evidence that's sufficient, and you need acceptance of the norms. Now, if you think of this in the case of the laws, like what would happen if you had half the people agreeing with the law that they're trying to decide on, and half of the people not agreeing with the law that they're trying to decide on? It's going to interrupt the process. You're not going to get a fair judgment. And in fact, this is precisely, well, I probably shouldn't say this. This is precisely why I think abortion laws are seldom tried, because this would be exposed. Abortion's, I think, a bad instance of a law. I was raised Catholic. I understand morally the problem, but it's bad just because it's not generally agreed upon by everyone. So if people were going to make a kind of decision like this, there wouldn't be the sort of acceptance needed. And it is really tantamount to putting someone in a circumstance where you're, you know, like, could you imagine if people just were allowed to do whatever they wanted with mathematics? Well, they do. I mean, it's, you know, bad moral reasoning is kind of similar to failing a math exam. In the sense that there's a, you know, a disconnect with the kinds of standards that you need.
So for example, somebody's saying that, you know, I'm the president and there were 50,000 people at my inauguration, you know, and then of course there weren't, you know, there may be 10,000. They're just lying, like people we see around us lying and breaking both norms, science, and math, right? I mean, they're,
Yeah.
and nothing happens. There's no laws that seem to restrain this phenomenon that seems to be happening.
Yeah.
So what do you think Hume would say about that?
Well, I mean, it is, that's, that is a problem. I mean, I think part of the problem with laws now are, well, a big problem has to do with money. I mean, think of how many people are involved in that Epstein fiasco. And nothing would elicit judgments of blame easier than the penalties in that case. But really, there's just one person, maybe two, who are going to end up being. So there are people that do things and they're not held accountable because they have money. And in fact, well, I mean, most of the people in prison are there because of poverty or there because of mental illness or other kinds of explanations. So there are a lot of things that are wrong with the prison system. But one of the things about this is that and when you start talking about deception, that adds another layer onto it. But even if we don't deceive, even if we try to be truthful, there's still going to be disagreement. But, you know, hopefully you can learn some sort of lessons here, because I think really, you know, if you're disagreeing with somebody about, say, some moral judgment, you just get them to start talking about, well, what are the norms behind this? What are the laws that you're, and then that's the disagreement. And it's not clear, you know, what to do with that on a you know, a personal level. But if you think about it on a social level, you know, when we think about the kinds of laws that we should have in a state, we should have laws that will be accepted by the average person who might appear on the jury, so that they can make a vindictive inference without impingement, without it being distracted by other kinds of issues, like, you know, jurors should never have to decide, well, is that a real law? But of course, if you don't think something is a social norm, you know, part of this is it's a sort of natural thing. So these judgments of blame are genuinely sentiments. So they just naturally arise when you are exposed to evidence of a certain kind, and have a certain kind of normative appreciation. But then when you have laws that don't resonate with all of the people, that's a distraction. It's an impingement on the process, on a natural process. I mean, part of it is, I mean, values, there's a lot to say about that, but there is something that we have in common. We do formulate the same kinds of judgments. They do have standards. And so it is a place that we could start. And certainly, we should start that way in the law. When you think about the kinds of laws that we have, they should be ones that are generally accepted, that would raise the sentiment, you know, we want to arrest people, not because they're poor, but because they're threats to the community, they do things that make us upset. You know. Sorry.
Okay, so so to me, what we're talking about here shines a light. I'm going to talk about the Trump part, where he makes up lies all the time, and then not to soften the ludicrousness of his making up that kind of thing, but what you're saying is, or is this right, that my judgment of his saying things like that is evidence of he has a completely different social norm, and the people that accept that kind of thing have a different social norm, so they come up with different verdicts of blame.
Well, this is where it gets complicated and things like deception come in, because he's just doing it. It's rhetorical on his part. I don't think there's any sincerity involved.
So then, but how do we?
Yeah.
So if it's so we need to go, and instead of saying, "Hey, don't lie," we've got to be sure that everybody has a social norm that lying or whatever he's doing is bad. So how do we? Anyway.
I think the advice comes best, you know, when we think about laws, the kind of laws that are inappropriate and the kinds of laws that are appropriate. I think that there's an argument to be had here for why some laws, especially laws that are shared by, or norms that are shared by half the country, should not be made into laws, because they're going to, you know, and that's just one kind of.
Because they're not more than half, you mean?
Should be more than that.
Yeah, I think, well, think of it this way. What we really want to make criminal are the kinds of things that disgust us, right? Not the kinds of things that, like, piss us off and that we can live with, but the kinds of things that are revolting, that we want to stop. It is a distraction. We're not limiting those things, by the way, right? There are a lot of horrible things that happen, and we even know about it, the Epstein files, right? I mean, we know these horrible things happen, and we're not doing anything about those. But that's the other part of this, is that has an effect, right? We are upset by that. We are outraged because blame is essentially a sentiment. It's a human emotion that we feel. And so, I mean, that's a kind of political disadvantage, to have half the country outraged by a certain set of activities, too. And so, you know, again, I mean, there's no easy solution based on this evidence. I'm not sure how to pack this up. But what I think is positive about it is that it does a lot of things. The biggest thing that it does is you can't just give value judgments and think, I have no say on that. I mean, they have a structure, they have, and whether value judgments are true or false, it doesn't really matter, because in all this, the theory that I presented so far, I've not said anything about whether judgments of blame are in the category of true or false. I just explained how they arise, and so it's open to a lot of different kinds of conversations. But just moving away from thinking of value judgments as being true or false, because if you think of something like the judgment of blame in the way that we looked at it, it just exceeds the event itself, no matter how horrible that event is, because there's a kind of finding of fact that's included in it. You consider all these possible situations of what might have happened to determine whether it was a genuine crime or an accident or something else. And all that other stuff beyond the event, we are literally adding to the world in a way. It's not the event that is a coloring of the event. It's sort of, and that's why Hume uses the term sentiment here, a sort of projection of, really how we want reality to be or not be, not like a reality.
But when these events happen, like we're so, we're looking at the information. There's so much information, and in order to make a value judgment, and you're trying to see the context and everything, you never have time for that because there's so much coming at you. Is that real? Is that a lie? Why is that? Why did he say that? And then you're onto something else, and so you can never really grasp at one of these events and have a real idea of what's behind it. Is it true? Is it false? And you're busy working on that when 3 other things have happened.
This is why we should generally not make judgments of blame, because we're very rarely in the kind of situation that, say, a jury is in, where they are privy to information that people rarely see, really get a hold of. I do think judgments of blame are kind of the things that you should only make in certain kinds of contexts. And note, there's nothing really about any of these other kinds of judgments. We haven't even really talked about those. But I do think some care in, I'll have a slide later down here about some care in, I just talked about judgments of blame, but I think that this is true of value judgments in general. But, so verdicts are unwarranted if they're the result of lack of evidence or misunderstanding of norms. But every verdict that somebody gives is usually falls in that category. It's very seldom. It has to be a case like Epstein, where the norms are clear, and he's not guilty, so the evidence is there. There are cases like that, I think, where judgments of blame are kind of fair, but assertions of blame imply a kind of epistemic competence. So it implies the idea that the person is privy to enough evidence to draw a sufficient verdict. And it suggests an ability to kind of provide justification. So, and there's a woman, she was at Princeton for a while, I can't recall her name, but she was both a psychologist and a philosopher. And she did work on blame, and a big part of her, and she works in a clinical context. So in a clinical context, blame is just no good. You can't, you just can't use it. And so, but she thinks assertions of blame are almost always wrong. Because of this sort of epistemic situation, we're rarely in an epistemic situation to kind of make that. And it does have some kind of effect. The feeling of blame has a kind of negative cost that comes with it. So I do think there are some kind of norms on speaking about value judgments, but one thing that you can carry with you when you come into a disagreement with somebody, well, disagreements are going to be natural in the area of values, though, precisely because they don't tie on to the facts in any sort of neat way. But I also think that we don't have to, seek the same values. We just have to seek the same broad sets of values. Like if we could just agree on the kinds of behavior we don't want, and if we were actually capable of preventing it, or arresting the kinds of people who perform that behavior, the world would be a lot better.
Yeah, Joe, in the circumstance I'm thinking about is the arguments of the anti-vaxxers in our community, which I don't know if we're talking half of the public who no longer believe that vaccinations are a good thing, or at least the way they've always been traditionally done. So if it was Hume who was speaking to an anti-vaxxer or a vax advocate, how would they go about that argument?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean,
Because we're talking science.
Hume is famous for like the problem of induction, which kind of suggests, that maybe science isn't as great as we think it is. But I don't think that was his real view. I think he did think of science as a sort of source of knowledge. But the problem in this area of disagreement, though, is not so much the information as the sources of information. So my friend Neil Levy is going to give a talk, actually in a couple of weeks, I think is relevant to this issue, on disagreement. So I think and this is his view actually, the real problem about like anti-vaxxing, or if you think of global warming or something, it's just that people think that it's a lack of information or intelligence, but a lot of these anti-vaxxers have degrees, they know a lot about science, but they don't trust mainstream science. And so they gravitate towards other sources of information in terms of trust. That's a huge issue. I'm not sure. I mean, you can't like reason your way out of that, because any attempt to try to convince them would be relying on some kind of source that they don't trust, essentially.
It seems to me that there's another layer operating in that, and that's the emotional and moral predisposition to come to conclusions that don't align with any of the rulemaking.
Right. Yeah, what do you mean in the case of are you talking in particular about?
Well, take, could I use another example that might
Sure.
be leading us astray? A presidential candidate once said, I can shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and and my voters would still vote for me. That sounds to me like it has nothing to do with rulemaking, but
Yes.
an emotional predisposition to a conclusion that in this case, that's okay for me, even though it violates the social norms that we would all agree to. I mean, that's an example. An example of a predisposition that voter would bring to an event.
So over time, laws are put on the books because of public sentiment or public value. When those laws are broken, blatantly broken, and no one does anything about it, what is the outcome of that? And I'm thinking about Trump demolishing the East Wing of the White House. He did it, he violated numerous laws doing that, and he says they don't pertain to me. They are laws on the books that have been developed over time, he's ignored them. So down the road in the future, what is the outcome of that kind of settlement?
Yeah, I don't know. Well, it does bring up this point that I made before, that because it's connected with sentiment, failures to follow the law upset us. I mean, again, this is a kind of, I mean, how many people like to listen to the news anymore? People used to love, like 10 years ago, we used to love listening to the news. I can't stand it anymore. It's just horrible. But that it has a lot to do with blatant violations of what I consider to be laws. So,
I think we have to be faster with updating our laws. I feel like most of the laws are, I mean, frankly, even the best ones that are actually, you know, doing what we all morally agree should be done are really old. And we just need to move all of that faster so that I feel like our laws and our judgments and social norms are more modern, because things are changing so quickly.
I would argue that not tearing down the east wing of the White House, that is not an obsolete law.
yeah.
No, well,
But the approval is the law. The law was that he needed congressional approval to do something like that.
And historic preservation.
All of those laws around it were violated, and no one's doing anything. No
What's the
one's saying.
consequences of, yes.
We need mutiny.
This Hume is 200 years ago.
Yeah.
It was a simpler time. They probably didn't have a word like algorithm. They certainly didn't know about a lot of things that we know today,
Sure.
how bad the misinformation is, because people make it up and then it's on their news show.
Well, he didn't know about social
Yeah.
media.
No, there are a lot of things. I mean, people keep asking what would Hume say, but I don't think he could have anticipated
Simpler time.
the madness that we have today. It seems like it's gotten a little, yeah. And once you add deception into it, and I do think that is what's, well, I don't know, one thing I think that isn't unfortunate is that we are amidst of a kind of political battle that is sometimes made to seem like a battle about values. But I just don't believe it. Like, I don't believe that people are always being honest about the values that they're expressing in these debates sometimes. It's more of, I have the values that my team has than some heartfelt value.
You know, for a lot of people that I know, just the fact that there is a social norm or a law about something is actually the only reason for doing that. And
A little louder, please.
Can you repeat that, please?
I just was saying that for a lot of people, the fact that there is a social norm or a law about something, that becomes really the only impetus for, you know, performing a particular act.
Yeah.
Just the fact that, you know, they're establishing their individuality or their own personal creativity or whatever. I'm just curious how that would work into this kind of
I was thinking when BJ was talking that it does add a complication that, you know, some of us will follow something because it is the law. I mean, so we're morally inclined to follow laws.
even if it's
And that complicates it complicates, I think, the process. I think in all of this it's, you know, coming to a kind of agreement on, and I do think, see, I think for Hume it's kind of a process because over time, I think he thought this would happen, that over time, we would develop the right kinds of social norms, right? Because we have some trials and half the people would disagree, and so, okay, those are bad laws, and we would adjust. It hasn't really happened. But another important thing is the social norms, they don't have to be like the laws of morality or whatever. They just have to be the most constructive rules that will get the best kind of behavior. So there's room to play with there.
Seems like the more laws you have, the more criminals you're gonna have.
Well, and laws, for example, in Nazi Germany, to hide, or right now, for example, in Portland, people are protesting against, ICE. But so a better example is like Nazi Germany, okay? And you are supposed to go out and shoot certain people, minority groups, whatever. And it's the law, or you can't sell something to some minority group, or you have to treat minority groups, and that's the law. So it depends. Doesn't the law also depend on the political climate and the norms and the laws that are being established? They're not always necessarily right.
Yeah.
I mean, for a lot of the population. So those change, and I think those are changing now. At least that's what it appears to be that the government is trying to do, to make it illegal, for example, to say anything against the government, or so those laws you might not want to follow, like if you don't believe in what the government is telling you to do. And you would be breaking the law by, for example, speaking out against the government.
Yeah. I mean, this is another bad outcome of bad laws, is that people don't follow them, usually. And people will do what they think is right. And there's got to be...
Do that though? Because you might think it's right, but it's the penalty of law or death. You might be sent to jail forever, or whatever, for life.
All
or
things considered.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, taking all those things into consideration, still try to do what you think is best for yourself. So.
Right. Or society, yeah. Some people,
well,
we have 3 more minutes.
Oh, okay.
Well, all of these that you're talking about, the opposites, well, he thinks this, she thinks this,
Yes.
the values, this all implies that there should be some kind of dialogue, and it's not happening. Someone puts it out, and you say, well, maybe everybody doesn't agree with that, well, then they should be talking about it, and I think that's where your angels.
And I think where the dialogue should be headed is not like what the utopian laws are like. What do we need in order to what do we have in common? What do we need in order to make this?
And that's where the regular angels came in, which is where you started.
Yes, right. Right.
So 2 more minutes, Joan.
Okay.
I also feel like, I just want to say this, I also feel like back then, it is quantifiable fact, there was not the huge difference in wealth that there is now. Yes, there were people that had tons and tons more than other people, but now it's like so beyond comprehension that maybe all the people that aren't billionaires are operating from a completely separate social norm system. And anyway, there's just so much money that we can't,
Going back to the feudal system.
Yeah.
Like, if you go back far enough, all of the wealth was held by a handful of people. Even worse than today in this country.
Oh, okay.
We blew that up here, and it's been different in this country, but now it's starting to fall back into that.
Joe, do you want to wrap it up?
This is sort of an outline I'm kind of trying to work for, where you have these 2 different, this is math and science, but I think the takeaway should be that value theory is just something different, and it's also kind of mysterious. It involves a little of us adding things to the world, and I think keeping mindful of that when you're having value discussions, that you're always sort of contributing something to yourself into the discussion, is important. That's it.
Thank you, Joe. Thanks a lot. Are there any? Thank you, Brenda. Are there any announcements?
What about November 5th?
November 5th, you want to come and talk about that?
Oh.
It's actually rather pertinent to Professor Campbell. Is it? Is it on?
Yeah, it is, but you have to
Okay.
talk right into it.
All right, yes. Okay, well, it is pertinent because we're going to have William Brock, who is a journalist who's been known in our area for some time, who's going to be speaking to us about journalistic integrity, what's happened to journalism in our time, and where we go from here. And he'll be here with us on November 5th.
12 to 1.
From 12 to 1, yes.
Which is a Wednesday, right?
Wednesday.
Just remind people to vote the day before.
Yeah,
Yes, I think the plan is for us.
and don't forget to vote the day before.
Don't forget to vote.
BJ?
I remind you to don't forget to vote on November 4th, and also early voting at the courthouse from now until Friday at 5 o'clock. And it's been very busy. They never expected a city election like it has been to have so many people voting, which is a good sign.
Thanks again. Thank you.
And I do want to thank
Thank you,
all
Joe.
for coming.